The Thames does not forgive. It never did. In the winter of 1840, the river was not a waterway. It was a living accusation, black with the discharge of 2 million bodies, thick with the rendered waste of slaughterhouses, tanneries, and the slow dissolution of the city's dead. It moved through London not as water moves, but as something heavier, something that remembered. Beneath the streets of Crossness, in the marshlands southeast of the city, a decision was being made. Not by politicians, not by engineers, by the ground itself, which had begun to refuse what London was feeding it. The cesspools were overflowing. There were, by official count in 1848, over 200,000 of them beneath the city, brick-lined pits sunk beneath homes, beneath courts, beneath the cellars of the poor. They leaked into the wells. They saturated the clay. In the summer months, the air above certain parishes was not breathable in the conventional sense. It was inhabited. It pressed against the skin, and still the city grew, and still the engines were not built. When they finally came, those 4 colossal beam engines, installed at Crossness Pumping Station between 1865 and 1871, they were called a triumph of civilization. The Times described the opening ceremony as a moment of genuine national pride. The Prince of Wales attended. Champagne was served in a chamber that would shortly begin receiving 12 million gallons of sewage per day. The engines were named Victoria, Prince Consort, Albert Edward, Alexandra. They wore their names like crowns. 63 feet of cast iron and polished brass. Pistons the diameter of a man's outstretched arms. The largest beam engines ever constructed for public sanitation. They did not merely pump, they declared something. They announced that industrial England had mastered its own excess. But beneath the ornamental ironwork, beneath the gilded capitals and the Gothic arches designed to make a sewage engine look like a cathedral, something else was being constructed, something the blueprints did not record. A labor economy built on bodies, men who entered the works and did not in any meaningful sense leave them. Who gave decades to the furnace rooms, the ash pits, the dark tunnels of the lower works, breathing what the engines exhaled, whose names were not recorded with the same care as the machines they served. And then, during excavation work carried out more than a century later, the ash deposits beneath the engine house floor were disturbed. 60 skulls were found. Here is the question that this story forces upon us, not why the engines were built. That answer is simple. The city was drowning in its own waste. The political will. Once the stench reached the windows of the Houses of Parliament in the summer of 1858, was suddenly violently present. How does a civilization construct a monument to human dignity? A machine to protect millions from disease, from contamination, from the slow violence of sewage-poisoned water, and in the very act of its operation, consume the men who maintained it. How does the remedy become its own form of poison? The Crossness Pumping Station was not a prison. No man was placed in chains. No gate was locked against departure. And yet 60 skulls found in ash speak a language official records never learned to write, of a labor system so total, so indifferent to human cost, that 30 years of a man's life could be surrendered to a furnace room and leave no trace beyond bone. A cathedral built for sewage, a triumph of civilization maintained by men the civilizations chose not to see. London in the 1840s was the largest city on earth, and it was killing itself. The population had doubled in 40 years. By 1851, over 2 million people occupied a geography designed, in its medieval bones, for a fraction of that number. 250,000 cesspools sat beneath homes, courts, and institutions across every parish. They leaked into the clay. They saturated the wells. In 1831, cholera arrived in England for the first time. It killed over 50,000 people in 2 years. In 1848, it returned. 14,000 dead in London alone. In 1853, 10,000 more. John Snow's work in Soho in 1854, tracing an outbreak to a single pump on Broad Street, gave science language for what the city already knew in its bones. The ground had become the enemy. Something beneath the streets had to change, permanently, monumentally. and at extraordinary cost. The man who answered the crisis was not a politician. He was an engineer. Joseph Basil Guet was appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856. 40 years old and precise in his calculations, he proposed 130 miles of underground brick sewer, intercepting existing channels before their contents reached the Thames, and redirecting everything eastward to holding stations on the river's edge. Sewage would be released only at high tide, carried downstream before the tide turned. 2 pumping stations would anchor the system: Abbey Mills to the north, Crossness to the south, built on the Erith marshes, on ground so unstable it required thousands of timber piles driven 40 feet into the clay before a single foundation stone could be laid. Construction began in 1859. By 1865, the Crossness engines were ready. 4 rotative beam engines, each standing 63 feet from floor to apex. Each beam weighed 52 tons. Designed by the firm of James Watt and Company, they were not merely functional objects. They were statements. The engine house reinforced that declaration. Designed in the Romanesque Revival style, its interior rose into vaulted arches of ornamental cast iron, painted and gilded, with columns bearing decorative capitals of interlocking foliage. The brasswork was polished to a mirror finish at the opening ceremony in April 1865. Each engine drove 4 ram pumps capable of moving 660 gallons per stroke. At full operation, the station lifted 12 million gallons of sewage daily. The engines ran on coal, delivered by barge, unloaded by hand, carried below to furnace rooms where fires never fully went cold. The machine demanded constant human attendance, every hour of every day, without interruption, without mercy. The engines were perfect. The men who served them were not accounted for with the same precision. Crossness was built on marsh. The ground beneath was perpetually damp, exhaling moisture that the furnace rooms above converted into something worse. A heat so saturated it did not feel like warmth. It felt like submersion. Stokers reported, in what few accounts survive, that the air below ground did not move. It accumulated: coal particulate, ash suspension, sulfurous discharge, and gases rising from the sewage reservoirs directly adjacent to the working areas. Ventilation specifications had been designed around the machinery. What a man could breathe across a 12-hour shift, across months, across decades, was not entered into the engineering drawings. It was not an oversight born of malice. It was an oversight born of category. Laborers existed in a different column of the ledger than equipment. Equipment was inspected, maintained, replaced when its tolerance had been exceeded. Men were hired. Men were worked. When their capacity failed, other men were available. The ash pits beneath the furnace rooms collected everything the engines exhaled, deepening over years into a sediment of industrial residue, dense, fine, and perpetually warm. A stoker at Crossness in 1870 began his shift before dawn. He descended below the engine floor through a narrow iron staircase, the heat rising against him as he went down rather than up. 6 boilers fed the 4 engines, each demanding continuous feeding, coal shoveled at measured intervals, the fire maintained within precise temperature tolerances. His shift was 12 hours. In winter, he would not see daylight on working days. His wages were sufficient for lodging in the workers' terraces, adjacent to the ship, sufficient for food, insufficient for accumulation. Men did not save money at Crossness. They exchanged their time for survival at a rate that kept them returning. The company provided housing, described as a benefit. In practice, it created a geography of obligation. To leave the work was to leave the home, and to leave the home with a family inside required a courage that exhaustion had a particular talent for eroding. Some men stayed 5 years, some 15. Records show several who remained for periods approaching 3 decades. They breathed the ash every day they stayed. The discovery did not happen with ceremony. In the early 1990s, the Crossness Engines Trust began restoring the station. By then decommissioned, deteriorating, its ironwork rusting into marsh air, restoration required excavation. Excavation required disturbing ground undisturbed for over a century. The ash deposits were dense, compacted by decades of accumulation and heat from above. They had solidified into a stratum of industrial sediment, several feet deep. When excavation tools reached the lower levels, they encountered resistance of a different kind. Bone, 60 skulls, recovered across multiple excavation points beneath the engine house floor. The remains were not arranged. They were not buried in any manner, consistent with intentional interment. They were distributed through the ash, as the ash itself was distributed. Accumulated, compressed, incorporated into the material record of the station's operational life. Forensic analysis dated the remains to the station's active period. Bone density and deterioration patterns were consistent with long-term exposure to extreme heat and particulate environment before death. These were not men who had died elsewhere and been moved. The evidence suggested sustained, decades-long proximity to the furnace environment itself. No official record named them. The administrative silence was total and, in its totality, eloquent. These men had been present enough to die there. They had not been present enough to be recorded there. The silence was structural, built into the administrative architecture of Victorian industrial labor with the same deliberateness that Bazalgette's engineers built the sewer network. Labor records document shifts covered, coal tonnage consumed, mechanical faults repaired. They do not document men as men. They document men as operational inputs, replaced when necessary, forgotten when gone. This was the common language of Victorian industrial management, spoken equally in the cotton mills of Lancashire, the ironworks of the Black Country, the shipyards of the Clyde. The laborer's body was a resource with a finite operational life. When that life was exhausted, the accounting closed. What made Crossness particular was the ash. Most industrial sites consumed their laborers and dispersed them into workhouses, into unmarked parish graves at sufficient distance to dissolve the connection. At Crossness, the marsh held everything. The ground refused dispersal. The sediment kept its record with a fidelity that the institution above had deliberately refused. The earth remembered what the ledgers chose to forget. The Crossness pumping station stands today as a Grade I listed building. On select open days, visitors descend into the engine house and stand beneath the gilded ironwork of Prince Consort and Victoria, restored to near their 1865 appearance. The brasswork catches the light. Guides explain the engineering. Children press their faces against the safety barriers and look up into the beam, frames with something resembling awe. Beneath their feet, the ash layer has been partially excavated, partially stabilized, partially left undisturbed. The 60 skulls rest in forensic custody, publicly unmemorialized. There is no plaque bearing names, because no names were recovered. The men arrived at Crossness, descended below the engine floor, and were absorbed into the operational life of the stations so completely that when it was done with them, nothing legible remained. This is what the engines built alongside the sewers, a system so total in its demands that human lives could be consumed within it and leave no administrative trace, only bone and ash, only the earth's refusal to complete the erasure. The Thames runs cleaner now. The city it serves has largely forgotten what that cleanliness cost. The engines do not forget. They simply stand, vast, gilded, and silent, above the ground that remembers everything.